the 2015 in the coup. It's also important to remember that before the Houthis took over Sana'a, there was a national dialogue between the parties. There was an agreement. Houthis' signature is on that agreement that there would be elections, and 6 months before the elections, the Houthis decided to launch an armed bid, allying with former dictator Ali Abdullah Saleh to seize Sana'a. In other words, the issue with regards to dialogue and negotiations, which is being called upon by the United Nations and the like, it's important to remember that negotiations have happened before, dialogue has happened before, everybody has agreed to the outcomes of this dialogue, and the Houthis decided that this was, instead of us respecting it, it's a good opportunity to launch this seventh war to establish Houthi rule, whereby the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad are the only ones who are allowed to rule Yemen, and that's what the Houthis are essentially fighting for. With regards to your question and the dynamics, the reality is that the Houthis want to assert themselves as the hegemon power, and they have been able to last despite the Saudi bombardment, and they have seen that the international pressure has been on the Saudis, not on the Houthis. It's been on the Saudis to stop bombarding the Houthis, not on the Houthis to stop their expansion. But recently, there's been a change on the military front. So whereas the Houthis before were able to expand despite the Saudi bombardment, the UAE have changed tactic and are now deciding to join the Saudis in attacking the Houthis on the military front. And the Giants Brigade, which are the allies of the UAE on the ground, which is a militia that has been trained and funded by the UAE, the Giants Brigade have been making advances into Houthi territory. So now what we're seeing is the Houthis trying to open a new front, whereby, whereas they were bombing Saudis before on the basis that no one sympathizes with the Saudis, they're now desperately trying to hit the UAE to sort of push the UAE back towards a policy of refraining from confrontation with the Houthis and focusing instead on their usual policy of trying to split Yemen and entrenching themselves in the south. The Houthis are now attacking the UAE, not necessarily because they want to defeat the UAE, but are lashing out to say, you're causing us real pain on the military front. You've shut off our supply line to our troops that are fighting Marib. Marib is important because the Houthis want to use its oil resources to pitch for autonomy in the north. They're trying to hit the UAE now to open a new front. And the reality is that because they have dragged their heels on negotiations and on talks, the US officials who believe that Saudi was the problem are increasingly coming to the conclusion that it was never Saudi all along. That I describe it because there is no rapprochement between Iran, between the Saudis and the UAE. What's taking place is that there is a rapprochement between Iran and Washington, and the Gulf allies are now squeezed by Biden and squeezed by Washington into talking with the Iranians. And I think this is what is unfolding, in that Iran believes that it doesn't matter what Saudi and UAE think. Biden is going to force them to recognize it and talk to them, and therefore they can keep attacking UAE and Saudi. They can keep launching missiles at Saudi and the UAE. Biden in the end is going to tell these two nations to swallow their pride, to swallow that pain, and to talk to Iran, because for Biden, the nuclear deal is far more important than any of these Gulf interests. But it's also important to note that it's true that they are backed by the Houthis. It's true that their weapons are being supplied by the Houthis. But also it's important not to negate the Houthi agency here, which is that the Houthis from 1962 have been committed to reasserting family rule, hereditary family rule on Yemen. And they were fighting even before they received supplies from the Iranians. They lost 6 wars, they lost 6 attempts, and with Iranian support, this is the most success they've ever had in their bid to establish hegemony over Yemen. I think the reality is that as long as the Houthis believe that a military solution is possible, that they have a green light to continue expanding militarily, then they will ignore all talks. And the reason I say this is not to bash the Houthis, but to remind everyone that 2013, 2014, there was a national dialogue. Houthis signed, everyone celebrated, and Houthis reneged. In 2018, when Hodeidah was about to fall, a vital stronghold for the Houthis, the UN rushed in, rescued the Houthis, established talks. There was an agreement in Stockholm. You'll remember Yemen's foreign minister saying Houthis are our brothers, and this was just a spat, and now we have real peace. The Houthis reorganized, got their weapons again, and decided to break the agreement and go back to expanding once more after the government forces had retreated from vital lines. So the issue here is not with regards to the actual talks or negotiations. These have taken place before. The problem is that the Houthis believe that ideologically they are the only ones entitled to rule Yemen, and that therefore any agreement to talk is only a battle tactic to restore their efforts. So until the military solution is blown out of the question, which appears to be now the policy of Biden, UAE, and Saudi Arabia, Biden appears to have allowed them to strike until they strike the military solution out of the minds of the Houthis, no peace talks can be taken seriously. And that's why Marib is so important. And I'll finish on this point, because the Houthis believe that if they take Marib and then go to the negotiating table, then they have a strong case for a separate autonomous northern state. If they don't take Marib, they can't bid for autonomy because they'll be heavily dependent on resources in UAE-backed South and in Saudi-backed eastern Yemen. In other words, for the Houthis, they need Marib and they must fight for Marib if they want any chance of achieving the aims with which they set out to fight 7 wars in the first place.